The story begins in a bustling urban neighborhood during the late evening. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the sidewalks are alive with the rhythmic hum of city life. Cars whiz past, people chat outside corner stores, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafts from a nearby bakery. It's the kind of evening that feels simultaneously ordinary and layered with untold stories. We meet Sarah, a 22-year-old college student with a slightly disheveled yet studious appearance. She clutches her backpack tightly while walking briskly along the uneven pavement. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, Sarah appears nervous. Her eyes dart toward every shadow and figure, possibly the weight of a stressful day or something deeper troubling her. She's just finished a grueling study session at the campus library and is eager to get back to the safety of her small apartment nearby. Her internal monologue reveals flashes of worry, an argument from earlier in the day, a missed phone call, a sinking feeling of unease she can't shake. Yet, on the surface, she's just another young woman navigating city streets alone after dark. In the meantime, Officers Jackson and Carter are patrolling the area in their police cruiser. Both are well-respected members of the force, balancing their commitment to public safety with the challenges of being black officers in a complicated societal landscape. Officer Jackson, a 12-year veteran with a commanding yet compassionate demeanor, frequently talks to his younger partner, Officer Carter, about the importance of staying calm under pressure. Carter, only 4 years into his career, has a sharp wit and a passion for justice, but struggles with the weight of societal expectations. Tonight, their radio crackles to life, alerting them to reports of a female suspect potentially involved in a nearby robbery. The description is vague: young, wearing casual clothing, possibly armed. Neither officer realizes that this nondescript report will lead to a crossroads moment, not only for them, but for the entire community they serve. As Sarah unknowingly crosses paths with the officer's cruiser, the stage is set for a misunderstanding that will unravel deeper layers of prejudice, systemic bias, and ultimately, the resilience of human connection. Sarah's heart rate spikes when she notices the police cruiser slow down as it nears her. She glances over her shoulder and picks up her pace, unsure whether they're following her or just coincidentally headed in the same direction. "Subject spotted," Officer Jackson says, eyeing Sarah from his seat. Her appearance roughly matches the description from the earlier alert. Young, female, casually dressed, and walking near the area of the reported crime. Carter double-checks the report on their onboard system. It's not much to go on, but their training urges them to investigate further. Pulling up next to Sarah, the officers step out of the cruiser. "Excuse me, miss, can we have a word?" Jackson says firmly, but not unkindly. Sarah freezes mid-step, her eyes wide with confusion. "What's going on?" she asks, clutching her backpack tightly. "We need you to put your hands where we can see them," Carter adds, keeping his distance but ready in case she runs. Her pulse races as panic sets in. "Wait, why?" "I didn't do anything," she stammers, her voice trembling. Before she can fully process what's happening, Jackson and Carter approach her cautiously, informing her she's being detained under suspicion of involvement in a robbery. Sarah's mind reels. Robbery? She'd been in the library all evening. Tears spring to her eyes as she protests. "This has to be a mistake. I wasn't anywhere near a robbery. I was studying." Her voice quivers, desperation laced in her words. but her frantic pleas only add to the tension. Jackson and Carter exchange wary glances. They've both experienced moments when individuals protest too loudly to avoid capture. Despite her protests, they move to cuff her, explaining its protocol until they can verify her identity and alibi. "I swear you have the wrong person!" Sarah cries as the cuffs click into place, the cold metal biting into her wrists. The scene quickly draws the attention of passers-by. A small crowd begins to form, some pulling out phones to record the unfolding incident. "What's she even done?" one man shouts, aiming his phone camera at the officers. "This doesn't look right," mutters a woman to her friend, watching as Sarah continues to sob and plead her innocence. Tensions mount further as murmurs ripple through the growing crowd. "Black cops arresting a white girl, ain't that something?" someone comments cynically. The officers feel the weight of the stares and the social dynamics of the situation. Jackson maintains his professional demeanor, but Carter can't help feeling uneasy about the optics. They both understand that the racial undertone of the scene is painting a narrative they haven't yet unraveled. While Sarah is guided to the back of the cruiser, a loud voice in the crowd calls out, "This is exactly what's wrong with the system. People jumping to conclusions, arresting the wrong person." The air is thick with tension as the officers attempt to explain the situation to bystanders. But with Sarah's teary protests echoing, few seem willing to listen. The arrest becomes less about procedure and more about a volatile collision of perceptions, identity, and mistrust. At this moment, neither Sarah nor the officers realize they've set in motion events that will uncover biases far beyond this single interaction. Sarah sits in a dimly lit interrogation room, her hands now free of cuffs, but her wrists sore and her spirit shaken. Her disheveled hair and puffy, tear-streaked face reflect the emotional toll of the past hour. Officers Jackson and Carter observe her through the two-way mirror, discussing the situation. "She's adamant she's innocent," Carter says, running a hand over his face. "What if we're wrong?" Jackson nods but remains cautious. "Protocol first. Let's question her and see what checks out." When the officers enter, Sarah flinches, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. "I already told you," she says with a shaky voice. "I was at the library all night. Check the cameras, my phone, anything." They begin asking basic questions. Her whereabouts earlier in the evening, who she was with, and whether she recognized the area of the crime. As Sarah speaks, the story she tells is precise. She even pulls out her phone to show her location history, time-stamped text messages, and photos taken in the library earlier that night as part of her group study project. The officers exchange glances. Slowly, the details start to align. Meanwhile, the station's detective team compares Sarah's statements with additional reports coming in. Surveillance footage near the crime scene shows a woman with similar features fleeing in a different direction. Someone wearing nearly identical casual clothing, but with a slight scar on her arm, a detail the officers hadn't noticed on Sarah. Further investigation reveals a witness who got a better look at the actual suspect, describing her as having short hair and walking with a limp. Sarah's long hair and steady stride were clear mismatches. A sense of relief mixed with frustration washes over the team as they begin piecing together the identity of the true perpetrator. It becomes increasingly evident that Sarah is not the person they're looking for. When the officers return to inform Sarah of their findings, her immediate reaction is anger. "So, I've been treated like a criminal for no reason. I've never even been near a robbery in my life," she exclaims, her voice shaking with indignation. Jackson looks at her empathetically, but firmly replies, "We made a mistake based on the information we had, and for that, we're deeply sorry. But there's something else we found that might explain why you were targeted." Sarah raises her eyebrows, confused but intrigued. As the officers dig into the initial call that flagged Sarah as a suspect, they uncover a disturbing truth. The anonymous tip that identified a young woman in a hoodie near the area was suspiciously vague and later linked to a person who had been involved in a heated argument with Sarah earlier that day. Further probing reveals that this person had a history of racially motivated actions. They had seen Sarah with her black classmates earlier at a coffee shop, defending them against discriminatory remarks. The argument grew loud, drawing attention, and ended with the other person storming off. The officers now begin to see that Sarah's arrest might not just have been an honest mistake, but a consequence of someone else's racial bias weaponized against her. Sarah sits in stunned silence as the officers explain their findings. Her initial anger gives way to a heavy realization. Her wrongful arrest is connected to deeper, systemic biases. The very notion that someone might call the police out of spite, and the police acting on such vague information, shakes her understanding of justice. For Officers Jackson and Carter, this discovery weighs heavily, too. They're not only reckoning with their roles in her wrongful arrest, but also with how racial prejudice can seep into their line of work from unexpected angles. The investigation becomes more than clearing Sarah's name. It highlights the need to address biases, both overt and implicit, not only in the public, but also within law enforcement processes. Sitting across from Officers Jackson and Carter in the interrogation room, Sarah rubs her wrists absent-mindedly, her anger now subdued but replaced by a fragile resolve. With a shaky breath, she begins recounting an earlier incident that, unbeknownst to her, played a significant role in her current situation. "That argument," Sarah begins, "it wasn't just some random disagreement." She looks up, her voice gaining strength. "It was about how people treat others who don't look like them. My classmates, Jerome and Tasha, invited me for coffee earlier today. This older man started making nasty comments under his breath, calling them things I don't even want to repeat." Sarah clenches her fists as she recalls stepping in to defend her friends. "I told him he had no right to talk to them that way. We were just there trying to study like anyone else. But he didn't stop. He got louder, and when I wouldn't back down, he threatened to call someone. I didn't think he'd actually follow through." Her eyes glisten with unshed tears as she realizes the implications of her courage earlier in the day. "I think he's the one who called the police. He wanted to teach me a lesson for standing up to him." The room falls silent as Officers Jackson and Carter absorb her words. Digging deeper into the source of the police tip, the officers trace it back to an anonymous caller whose description eerily matches the man Sarah described. When they play back the recording of the call, the details further confirm her suspicion. The caller's voice drips with disdain as they vaguely describe a troublesome young woman in a hoodie, probably hiding something. This wasn't a random report. It was premeditated and driven by prejudice. The discovery leaves the officers stunned and deeply unsettled. The revelation forces Officers Jackson and Carter to confront an uncomfortable truth. Although their actions followed procedure, the system's reliance on unverified bias tips created a dangerous situation. They realize that while they weren't directly at fault for arresting Sarah, they had been tools in a much larger problem: the ease with which prejudice can manipulate processes designed to ensure justice. "Someone weaponized us," Carter says bitterly, breaking the silence. "That man used us to intimidate her." Jackson nods, a heavy sigh escaping him. "And we let it happen because the system doesn't do enough to weed out bad faith reports. We need to fix this, starting now." Sarah's anger softens as she sees the genuine regret in their expressions. She recognizes that these officers, despite being on the other side of the table, aren't the villains she initially thought. Instead, they too are caught in a web of societal bias, just from a different angle. For the first time, a bond begins to form. Jackson and Carter pledge to not only clear her name, but to address the structural flaws that allowed this injustice to happen in the first place. Sarah leaves the station with a new understanding. She had assumed the system's flaws were simple: good versus bad, wrong versus right. But now, she sees the layers of prejudice that impact everyone, often in unexpected and intersecting ways. For Officers Jackson and Carter, the incident serves as a wake-up call, pushing them to take action, not only to repair their mistake, but to advocate for meaningful changes in how reports are handled and verified. The shocking revelation doesn't just clarify what happened, it ignites a shared determination to confront the biases that ripple through individuals, communities, and institutions alike. With the shocking revelation fresh in their minds, Officers Jackson and Carter decide they cannot let this incident fade into just another statistical mistake. They know Sarah's wrongful arrest is bigger than any single encounter. It represents deeper cracks in the justice system that need fixing. The two officers make the bold choice to confront their department about the flaws that enabled Sarah's arrest. They submit a detailed report highlighting the dangers of relying on vague and unverified tips, especially when such reports can be influenced by prejudice. They also advocate for improvements to existing procedures, such as requiring corroborating evidence before initiating arrests based on anonymous calls. Recognizing the value of transparency, Jackson and Carter don't stop there. They reach out to local journalists to tell the full story, not just of their mistake, but of the lessons they learned from it. Their decision to publicly admit fault sparks mixed reactions within the police force, but earns them respect from many community members who see their actions as brave and necessary. The officers' willingness to take accountability and act for change gradually shifts Sarah's perspective. She begins to see them as allies rather than adversaries. When they approach her to offer a personal apology, their sincerity is evident. "We made a mistake, and we're truly sorry," Jackson says. "We can't undo what happened to you, but we can make sure the system improves so this doesn't happen to anyone else." Though still shaken by her experience, Sarah acknowledges their efforts. "I'll hold you to that," she replies with a faint smile, a hint of trust rekindling. Meanwhile, the bystander videos of Sarah's arrest gain traction online. Initial clips of the incident stoke outrage, with people debating everything from the racial dynamics of the arrest to the officer's professionalism. However, as more details emerge, particularly about the racially motivated call that led to the incident, the narrative begins to shift. The story now evolves into a complex discussion about intersectional bias, weaponized prejudice, and accountability in policing. News outlets pick up the story, and Sarah is approached for interviews. Though hesitant at first, she decides to use the platform to share her experience and demand systemic change. Empowered by the support she receives online and the genuine efforts of officers Jackson and Carter, Sarah transitions from victim to advocate. She partners with local activists and organizations to push for reforms, including improved police training on bias detection and response, stricter guidelines for acting on anonymous tips, community oversight committees to ensure accountability in policing. Through her advocacy, Sarah emphasizes that her wrongful arrest isn't just a personal injustice, it's a symptom of broader societal issues. If we don't confront the biases in our systems, she says in one viral speech, we'll keep tearing ourselves apart instead of coming together. Sarah and the officers also begin appearing together at community forums and events, sharing their story as an example of how accountability and open dialogue can create progress. Their partnership captures the public's attention, showing that meaningful change is possible when individuals on opposite sides work together. Their efforts don't go unnoticed. Pressure mounts on the police department to adopt reforms proposed by Jackson and Carter, and slowly, changes begin to take shape. Bias training programs are expanded, anonymous tips are subjected to stricter verification processes, and community police relations initiatives gain momentum. The turning point marks not only a transformation in how the characters view one another, but also a spark for wider conversations about justice, accountability, and the power of collective action. The following weeks bring significant developments as the relationship between Sarah and the officers matures into something neither of them anticipated. Sarah is visited personally by officers Jackson and Carter at her apartment. They are here to make things right, not just to apologize again, but to show Sarah they are committed to taking action on the issues at hand. "We were wrong," Jackson says, his voice firm but sincere. "We should have questioned the details more carefully. We should have been more thorough, and for that we're sorry." Sarah meets their words with a reflective silence before responding, "You've apologized. But it's not just about me, is it? It's about the system that led to this happening." Her eyes well with unshed tears. "For you, it's a one-time mistake, but for me and for others, it's part of a much bigger cycle." Both officers nod, recognizing the truth in her words. Sarah takes a deep breath and, after a moment of quiet contemplation, shakes her head. "I won't press charges," she says finally, her voice steady. "But we need change, real, permanent change." In a moment of mutual understanding, Sarah outlines her vision for progress, echoing the broader conversation she's been having with activists, policymakers, and community leaders. She insists that in exchange for not pursuing legal action, the officers must champion procedural reforms, policy change, and a more equitable approach to policing in their department. "I want to see this institution recognize its flaws, and I want those flaws to be addressed," Sarah states, standing her ground. "And if you're committed to that, you'll have my support. But I won't settle for anything less." Jackson and Carter vow to be her partners in this process. Their response to Sarah's resolution isn't just motivated by duty. There's a personal accountability now. They understand that in order for things to truly change, it's not enough to apologize. They need to actively push for and create those changes themselves. As Sarah's demands start to find traction, the momentum spreads across the police department, thanks in no small part to the public attention garnered by Jackson and Carter's proactive involvement. They present Sarah's ideas in meetings with department heads, arguing that police practices should be reformed not only because of how they affect the people they serve, but because systemic change ultimately serves the officers themselves. These efforts result in several changes within the force. 1. Better suspect description. Protocols. Officers now receive better guidance on how to assess and report descriptions of suspects, reducing the risk of misidentifications and ensuring a broader understanding of how race and social context can shape their interactions with the public. 2. Bias awareness training. They introduce mandatory bias training that addresses both implicit and explicit biases, aimed at reducing the influence of stereotypes on decision-making and improving how officers approach interactions with the community, especially in situations with limited or ambiguous information. 3. Greater community involvement. The police department embraces Sarah's ideas of a closer connection between officers and the community they serve. Jackson and Carter lead outreach programs that encourage people from marginalized communities to share their concerns, allowing the police to make changes based on real community input. Sarah, empowered by her experience and her partnership with the officers, becomes a powerful voice for justice reform. She speaks at schools, community meetings, and on media platforms, advocating for systemic changes within law enforcement. She challenges stereotypes, pushes for inclusive policies, and promotes understanding in neighborhoods that are often caught in cycles of mistrust and fear. She uses her platform to educate others about the complexities of systemic bias and racism, emphasizing the need for both public accountability and institutional reforms. Sarah collaborates with advocacy groups, legal experts, and grassroots organizations to amplify her message. Her advocacy inspires a wave of public interest in police reform, sparking local efforts in various cities across the nation to reassess and improve interactions between law enforcement and communities of color. One of the final resolutions of Sarah's journey is her decision to hold a public community event alongside officers Jackson and Carter, aimed at fostering a new kind of dialogue, one that encourages the community and police officers to come together and work through misunderstandings openly. This marks an official milestone in both Sarah's personal journey and the wider process of reform within the department. At the event, Sarah and the officers speak candidly about what transpired, acknowledging the emotional and mental toll of the experience, but using it as a platform for progress. Their words are a powerful reminder that healing from conflict takes time, but the first step, acknowledging the problem, is critical. As the event concludes, the crowd's reaction is overwhelmingly positive. People from diverse backgrounds approach the officers and Sarah, offering their support and expressing hope for continued change. The event is an emotional one, marked by moments of applause, unity, and reflection. Officers Jackson and Carter feel a sense of renewed purpose. No longer simply law enforcers, they are advocates for change, actively working to bridge the divide that has too long separated their department from the community. Sarah's courage, her willingness to challenge the system, and her open dialogue with the officers have brought something genuinely transformative: the understanding that change, though difficult, is possible. This moment signifies a new chapter, not only for Sarah and the officers, but for the entire community they've worked together to transform. The story concludes with an empowering reminder. True progress lies in listening, accountability, and the unyielding pursuit of fairness and equality. The sun sets behind a bustling urban skyline, casting an orange glow over the community park where a group of neighbors, activists, and local leaders have gathered. This park, once a space where division ran deep between residents and law enforcement, now serves as a symbol of what can be accomplished when accountability, empathy, and action come together. At the front of the crowd stands Sarah, now a confident, well-spoken advocate for police reform. Beside her are officers Jackson and Carter, who have become prominent figures in the movement for change. Together, they address the community with a shared message of unity and transformation. Sarah begins, her voice clear and powerful. We all have a role to play in creating a society where justice isn't just a word, but a truth we live by every day. Today, I'm here not just to speak about my journey, but to thank those, like Officers Jackson and Carter, who chose to listen, reflect, and ultimately become part of the solution. As she speaks, people in the crowd nod, some teary-eyed, recognizing the weight of her words and the emotional depth of their shared experience. The officers, standing tall beside her, offer their insights, how the process of change starts with admitting mistakes, understanding the roots of systemic bias, and taking real steps toward altering old patterns. Carter, who is no stranger to the weight of his uniform, remarks, "It's easy to be reactive, to only act after something bad happens. What matters is that we, both as police officers and as people, embrace accountability before we even make mistakes. We owe it to those we serve to make this system better for everyone, not just the few who benefit from the status quo." Together, they take turns speaking about the road to forgiveness and transformation. Jackson adds, "It wasn't just Sarah who faced a challenge. Our entire department faced one that we weren't even aware of. But if we want to be the change, we have to live it every day. That's our new mission." As the crowd claps, the palpable sense of healing spreads through the park. People who had once felt wary of officers now share smiles and handshakes with the men in blue. The camera shifts to Sarah and the two officers as the crowd disperses, their faces marked by exhaustion but contentment. Sarah smiles at them both, recognizing the irony in it all. This unlikely trio, one young white woman and two black police officers, had transformed their community simply by doing something so rare, understanding each other. The narrator's voice begins, offering a broader reflection on the lessons learned. The complexity of race, bias, and justice can't be boiled down into easy answers. What happened between Sarah and the officers was not a single moment, but the intersection of personal choices, social pressure, and systemic flaws. But in a world where most problems feel insurmountable, one truth remains. True progress is often born from conflict, from those willing to listen, and from those brave enough to say, "I will do better." The camera pulls away slowly, focusing on Sarah, Jackson, and Carter standing together, facing the now peaceful crowd. The park, symbolizing both the scars of the past and the promise of the future, echoes with hope. The message rings out clearly. True growth begins with a willingness to examine what we have overlooked, to be honest about what has been wrong, and to keep pushing for a society where everyone has an equal chance at justice. Breaking cycles of misunderstanding and discrimination starts with small steps, the narrator continues, but it requires courage, determination, and an unwavering belief that a fair world isn't just a dream, it's a goal within reach. For Sarah, Jackson, Carter, and this community, that future begins today. The screen fades to black, and the final credits roll with a moving soundtrack that reminds the audience of the unity that's possible when all sides are willing to come together for a common cause, breaking down barriers, not creating them.